The pilot shortage that destroyed Japan's Navy. In December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed the most skilled carrier pilots on Earth. By late 1944, it was sending teenagers into combat with less training than American cadets received before their first solo flight. Japan did not lose the Pacific War because its pilots were inferior. Japan lost because it built no system to replace them. This is the story of how the most elite naval aviators in history vanished, and why their disappearance sealed Japan's defeat years before the war ended. The elite few before World War II, Japanese naval aviation was not designed to fight a long war. It was designed to win a short, decisive one. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service trained pilots through a system that emphasized perfection over scale. Acceptance rates hovered below 10%. Training lasted 2 to 3 years and required between 700 and 800 flight hours, far more than any other nation at the time. Carrier landings were practiced relentlessly. Long-range navigation over open ocean was mandatory. Dogfighting was drilled until instinctive. Mistakes were punished harshly. Weakness meant dismissal. Only the best survived. The result was extraordinary. By 1941, Japanese naval pilots were arguably the finest carrier aviators ever assembled. They struck Pearl Harbor with precision. They dominated Allied air forces in the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and early battles across the Pacific. At Coral Sea, Japanese pilots matched Allied aviators plane for plane. At the opening stages of the Guadalcanal campaign, they routinely outflew American pilots despite inferior aircraft durability. But beneath this brilliance lay a fatal flaw. Japan had built an elite force without a reserve. The assumption that killed the system. Japanese naval doctrine assumed war would be short, decisive, concluded by a climactic fleet engagement. Losses were expected, but limited. Pilots were treated as irreplaceable warriors, not components in a system of attrition. There was no expectation of prolonged combat bleeding experienced air crews year after year. As a result, there was no large reserve of trained pilots, no mass training pipeline, no scalable replacement program, no rapid expansion capacity. Pilots were craftsmen, artists, samurai of the air, and, like samurai, they were few. The United States approached the problem differently. American planners assumed heavy losses were inevitable. Pilots must be replaceable. Training must be expandable. Skill would improve through repetition, not exclusivity. America trained pilots as part of an industrial process. Japan trained them as a priesthood. Midway, the irreplaceable loss. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 is often described as the turning point of the Pacific War. But the true disaster for Japan was not the loss of 4 carriers. It was the loss of pilots. At Midway, Japan lost approximately 110 highly trained naval aviators, many of them combat veterans from China, Pearl Harbor, and the opening Pacific campaigns. Even more damaging, a significant number were flight leaders and instructors. These men could not be replaced. Japan could build new aircraft. Japan could even build new carriers. But the knowledge, experience, and instinct of those pilots vanished forever. One Japanese officer later wrote, "The carriers sank, but our true loss went down with the air crews." From that moment forward, Japanese naval aviation was living on borrowed time. The slow collapse of training. After Midway, Japan attempted to expand pilot training, but too late and without resources. Flight hours were cut from 700 to 800 hours pre-war to 300 hours in 1942, to 150 hours in 1943, to under 100 hours by 1944, Fuel shortages limited practice flights. Aircraft shortages forced students to share planes. Instructors were pulled from frontline units, weakening combat squadrons to train replacements who would themselves be inadequate. Training quality collapsed. Meanwhile, America was accelerating. By 1943, the United States Navy was training over 9,000 pilots annually. Training hours increased, not decreased. Pilots rotated out of combat to become instructors, ensuring combat experience fed directly back into the training system. American pilots arriving in combat in 1944 often had more total flight hours than Japanese pilots had when they graduated, and far more than those they now faced in the air. The skill gap reversed completely. Guadalcanal. Bleeding the elite. The Guadalcanal campaign from August 1942 to February 1943 was a war of attrition Japan could not afford. Japanese pilots flew long missions from distant bases, often at the edge of their aircraft's range. Losses mounted steadily. Veteran pilots were killed, wounded, or exhausted. There was no relief. American pilots, by contrast, rotated. Survivors returned home as instructors. New pilots arrived constantly. Japan's elite cadre was being consumed, one mission at a time. By early 1943, Japan had lost the core of its pre-war naval aviation force, the mathematics of defeat. By 1944, the numbers were merciless. Japan could still build aircraft, but not enough trained pilots to fly them effectively. American pilot training. Thousands graduating annually. Continuous improvement. Combat veterans feeding back into instruction. Japanese pilot training. Severely reduced hours. Inexperienced instructors. Students rushed to the front. Japanese carrier air groups in 1944 often consisted of pilots with less than 100 hours total flight time. Minimal carrier landing practice. No combat experience. American pilots arriving at the same time. 300 to 400 flight hours. Extensive gunnery training. Radar-directed interception experience. Coordinated squadron tactics. The result was inevitable. The Philippine Sea. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea revealed the full scale of the collapse. Japanese carriers launched over 400 aircraft. American radar detected them early. Fighter direction was precise. Pilots were experienced. In 2 days, Japan lost over 300 aircraft, and with them, nearly all remaining trained naval aviators. American losses were minimal. One U.S. pilot described it bluntly. It was like shooting turkeys. Japan's carrier aviation never recovered. By the end of 1944, Japanese carriers were effectively empty decks, ships without pilots. Kamikaze, a system admitting defeat. The rise of kamikaze attacks was not fanaticism alone. It was an admission of systemic failure. Japan no longer had the time, fuel, or instructors to train pilots properly. Aircraft were available. Pilots were not. Sending barely trained men on one-way missions required less instruction, less fuel, and no expectation of survival. It was not strategy. It was desperation. By war's end, Japan had aircraft sitting unused while pilots died without ever learning how to land on a carrier. America's conveyor belt of pilots. While Japan's system collapsed, America's expanded. The U.S. Navy treated pilot training as a logistics problem, not a cultural one. Standardized syllabi, multiple training bases, rotation systems, redundancy, feedback loops. Combat lessons from the Solomon Islands appeared in training manuals within weeks. Tactics evolved continuously. New pilots arrived better prepared than those they replaced. America didn't rely on heroes. It relied on systems, and systems scale. The war was already over. By late 1943, Japan had effectively lost the air war in the Pacific, not because of a single battle, but because its pilot replacement system had failed completely. By 1944, no tactical brilliance could compensate for the absence of trained air crews. By 1945, the outcome was inevitable. Japan entered the war with the best pilots in the world. America entered with the ability to replace them forever. One nation fought with excellence, the other fought with mathematics. In the end, the Imperial Japanese Navy was not defeated by inferior courage or inferior aircraft. It was defeated by a failure to understand modern industrial war. Wars are not won by having the best warriors at the beginning. They are won by building systems that endure attrition. Japan built pilots it could not replace. America built a machine that never stopped producing better ones. When Japan's elite vanished, the Pacific War's outcome was already sealed, long before the final battles were fought. The pilot shortage did not merely weaken Japan's navy, it destroyed it.